To all those who are watching, welcome. Our session today will be on Polanyian Perspective, Countermovements, the case of organic producers in Canada. And our presenter today here is Marco. Mark is a master's student in role planning and development at the University of Guelph, building on his experience from his baccalaureate in agriculture economics at Laval University, and driven by a national curiosity and a passion for agriculture and social sciences, he oriented his research topic at the intersection of those fields. The Polanyian approach was a natural choice of his thesis, offering a stimulating perspective of issues related to market regulations, resource use, and social acceptability. I am now going to pass it on to Mark, and you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I'll speak about the work I did for my thesis, which is called Polanyian Perspective, Countermovements, the case of organic producers in Canada. So I'll speak about what is this Polanyian Perspective Countermovements. I will also speak briefly about organic agriculture. I did a survey, so we'll look at the results, the research finding, and the policy implication. And as Madeleine said, it would take about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes or more of questions. So first of all, this Polanyian perspective comes from the name of Karl Polanyi, who is known for his critique of classic liberal political economy, mainly that he put into this book, The Great Transformation, the Political and Economic Origins of Our Time. It was published in 1944. And right from the title of the book, Great Transformation, Political and Economic Origins of Our Times, we can see that he had an interest into the great social changes and the interaction between politics and economics that were happening at his time. But he was not only a critic of the economic system, but also of the perception of economy itself. So he turned towards historical anthropological work he did on diverse society around the world, and he studied the different institutions that those societies were putting in place to organize themselves. And he found different patterns in the way that those exchanges and organization were happening within those societies. And he came to the conclusion that market exchange always existed in different societies, but were not an organ of economic self-regulation. So the market exchange was not in control of people's life or behavior, but it was rather a tool for society to organize themselves. So in his book, The Great Transformation, he claims that a fully self-regulated economy, as promoted by classic economists at the time, could not really exist because it would create socially and environmentally, socially unacceptable effect or negative consequences. So for Polanyi, those consequences would socially or environmentally consequences would be opposed directly or indirectly by those who are affected within a society. So the result of all this is that there is an attempt to liberalize the economy would likely face an attempt to constrain it, to reduce the negative social and environmental consequences it would create. And he called this a double movement, so one movement of liberalization and a counter movement. And I have maybe a different way of summarizing how he perceived this, or how people have worked with it. And I start with this. Free market exchange do not produce optimal outcome in terms of livelihood when it's related to human and natural resources. And the reason for this is that the complexity of human behavior, of our identity as human beings, and of natural environment is too complex to be fully captured in market exchange. So there is always something. That's why it's not an optimal outcome. There will always be something. There will be an issue or problem, negative consequences, negative effect, something we would like to see that's not happening. So what do you do when there is an issue with something? The first thing you can do is complain about it. That's, I think, a pretty natural way of the first thing that we do as a human being. But we can also go beyond that. And we can protest and ask for something to happen, or we can act ourselves to reduce this issue, this problems that we are perceiving. And this is the essence of the double movement. There is an issue and then you react about it. And this is as scholar that we do the link between the free market environment and an issue, but individual would generally, or member of a social movement would just see an issue and try to fix it. They will not necessarily do the link between market liberty or freedom of market and a specific issue. And while this is a really simple and natural behavior, it can be really complex when you delve down to an individual level. So there are many gray area within this concept, and I will speak about one more specifically, which is the different types of protection that individual will try to put in place to reduce an issue they are perceiving. And this will be done, and because it's such a natural behavior, it will be done in an organized way and a spontaneous way. It will be non-ideologically organized. It would come from all classes of society because this is something that everybody does. So the different types of protection, and they are a little bit of contradictions. So Polanyi's original work and what people have followed in this tradition is mainly to look at government types of protection. So a specific restriction coming from government entities. And when I say government, it would be all level of government. So municipal, provincial, federal, it could also go even beyond that at WTO level or something like that. And when Polanyi, the example that Polanyi were using were child labor, restriction, the different policies about worker safety measures, the development of public libraries, implementation of policies for trade unions, agrarian tariffs, land laws, management of currencies. So those are all mainly governmental types of action. And I was influenced by two scholars into questioning this. And I will speak a bit about them. The first one is Nancy Fraser, who was really critical that marginalized group would turn towards government if they're not recognized by government or don't recognize themselves in government, so they would likely turn towards something else to reduce issues or to protect themselves from the negative effect they are feeling. The second work is coming from Stephanie Malin. She worked, you might already know her because she worked on mining communities, uranium and petroleum communities, mainly in Colorado. And to summarize, she briefly realized that neoliberal ideas were getting naturalized into those communities, and that this naturalization was expressed by confidence into mining corporation or businesses in bringing the protection for the individual living in those communities. And she called this the triple movement, well, though I'm not going to use this term. So from that perspective, the self-regulation from the corporate entity is the way to achieve protection. So this is suggesting that there would be something else than governmental intervention to bring protection. So just to summarize, marginalized group, we have to ask ourselves, will they turn towards government? Maybe not. Um, there is also trust and network relationship that could be used to carry social or environmental value or reduce issues that people are perceiving. An example of that could be the non-certified organic agriculture, which relies on network and trust to bring different values on the marketplace. And what I will be focusing on is market tools, specifically labeling, that organic certification, and but that could also be cooperative. For those of you who are more familiar with Polanyi's work, you might notice this is not, I'm not speaking about transformative changes, so we're not trying to topple capitalism or something like that. And I used a more soft interpretation of his work, where the reaction, the counter movements are trying to stabilize themselves inside the current system. They're trying to resolve issues. They're not trying to change the whole system. So because agriculture is deeply related to land and natural resources and is labor intensive, then we would expect to find some protective counter movement in agriculture. So organic agriculture was a natural choice to look at. And more specifically, the organic agriculture is unique in the sense it has an organic certification. So it is a market tool that is enabling some values to be conducted on the marketplace. So from the perspective of this study, the organic agriculture is really only perceived from the certification view, and this is really a market tool. So a quick overview of what is exactly about what is organic agriculture. So it started in the 1900s early. It was concerned with, I put some issues on the screen, so soil degradation, industrialization, modernization of some aspect of life and agricultural techniques, changes in the diet after World War I, a loss of connection with the land, more exile towards the city, the development of synthetic inputs and fertilizers, and the movement, the organic proponents, included different aspects as it evolved. So genetically engineered organism, called GE, pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, air pollution. And now in Canadian system, we can even see artificial lights and social justice coming into this. And from being generally organized about or around cultural norms or more culturally integrated through network and trust, the organic movement and the organic market grew, and certification started appearing, and eventually we came with third-party certification systems. And basically what it does is there is a standard, fixed standard that everybody have to follow. And there is a company, this third party, that you pay that will come and validate that you really follow the standard, that you are complying. In the Canadian context, there is a federal legislation that applies to all international product, but also to inter-provincial product. While for each provinces, there is, it is not covered by the federal jurisdiction. This is a provincial jurisdiction. So each province can decide what they're going to put in their, how they're going to control organic on inside their province. So most provinces have implemented the same standard as the federal. It's just a copy. While some provinces, Ontario, PI, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan, don't have provincial regulations. So from this more historical perspective, there is a really, the narrative that the organic movement is carrying is is that, yes, it seems like it is offering some kind of protection to farmers and consumers. However, this is only one view of the organic movement. Some scholars and individuals and farmers have questioned this, and it's been called conventionalization. So the organic certification and now organic in general is mainly based on the certification. So it is mainly a market tool. So there are a lot of gray area and limits to what it can do. And I will speak about just few research. I won't explain what they did. I will just give the conclusion of individual who challenge this narrative of organic going in, let's say, in the right direction. So first, Altieri, Letourneau, and Davis, pretty early on, were saying that sustainable agriculture, which included organic, needed to go beyond agronomical changes and changes the whole system around agriculture. So the economic system and the culture around agriculture. More recently, Surford, Raman-Cotty, and Mayer Offer compared many standards around the world and came to the conclusion that most of them were focused on inputs, so the synthetic or natural aspect of inputs instead of, and we're not really speaking about the other aspect of organic, like water protection, soil protection, animal welfare, biodiversity. So those were kind of excluded of the standards. So those were not really implemented so much in the organic market. And this was echoing a work that Padel, Rucklingsberg, and Smith did earlier on, where one of their conclusion was that there was not much social element into the organic standards. Those would be not really implemented in the organic market. And most importantly, Bach, Getz, and Gottman, who developed the term conventionalization. And to bring it really simply, they were saying organic market is a market like any other. So the certification allows you to enter a restricted market, but once you have respected or complied with the minimum inside to get into the market, then all the other aspect will eventually get excluded because of competition inside this market. So from this conventionalization aspect, we can see that it is questioned whether this market tool of certification is really useful into bringing protection. And this is also what some Polanyian scholars have discovered. Barham really was more favorable, but she was looking at more a macro aspect, looking more at the narrative of the movement. And she found that the organic movement was kind of complying with this Polanyian idea of bringing protection, while Gottman, looking really at the certification, which included also fair trade, was really critical of the ability of label tools like certification to bring in or to be effective as bringing some kind of protection or reduce issues that individual would perceive. The two other scholars, Sid Aguayo and Mustafa Nezhad, were looking at more specific level at individuals, so at producers within the organic movement, and realized that individual had contradiction. So they would act in a way that would be following this Polanyian idea of trying to resolve an issue, but at the same time, they would be in a market dynamic and would act in a ways that would be conflictual with what they are trying to protect. So one example is about a woofer host. So they have volunteer coming on their farm, they have to feed them. So they have this philosophy of making sure that the employee or the volunteers develop whole philosophy about local food and growing your own food and cooking your own food. While at the same time, because it's so expensive to give them organic food, they were going at Costco to feed them. So you can have those contradictions at the individual level that question, again, how this tool of certification can be used to bring protection. So this is really what I was interested in. So the question I asked for this research was, do Canadian certified organic producer show a Polanyian reaction to negative economic, social, environmental impact of agricultural market? And by Polanyian reaction, I mean this idea of perceiving a consequence and then trying to resolve it. And then we've looked more specifically at the certification or government. So I did a survey. It was an electronic survey, so it was sent online. People had the link, could click on it. It was bilingual in French and English. It was sent throughout Canada, and it was distributed through different organic organization. So this is not a representative sample. Individual with no contact with organic organization never received the link. It was sent in February 27th, and then it was closed on May 12th. There were 126 full responses, so we deleted about 96 responses of responses that were not complete. And the survey had a really unique structure to be able to identify this what I would say Polanyian reaction of consequences, certification, and then governmental expectation. So this is what this is the survey structure. I will start by bringing your attention on the right side. So we could see there were three, we call them teams. So the first question was about consequence. And then the second question was about certification. And then the third question was about government. And then we ask those three questions for 11 aspects of organic, which we call dimensions. So the first one was free trade agreements. The second one was price instability. The third one was competition between farmers. The fourth one was family farms, local food production or local food systems, synthetic pesticides related to health, soil protection, degradation, animal welfare, biodiversity, genetically engineered organism, GE, and greenhouse gases production. And each of those dimensions were grouped into three categories. So economic category, social category, and environmental category. So we had, just to summarize, we had 11 questions for each team. So 11 questions about consequence, 11 questions about certification, and 11 questions about governments. So each dimension or aspect had 3 questions. And each individual was able to respond on a Likert type scale from 1 to 5. Although for all the analysis that we'll see, responses were aggregated to agree, neither, and disagree. So first thing first, we have to find out if organic producers do identify negative effect. First of all, to have this Polanyian behavior reaction. And I will just go back here. So the first analysis I'll show you is about the first section here. So just the first 11 questions. So what we have here is the same, is a similar design. So we have the 11 dimension in the bottom. We have the categories, which are the same ones. And then we have a proportion of responses of individual who agreed. So either strongly agree or agree. And then to decide whether this dimension or aspect of organic was perceived or not as having negative effect, we used a 50% threshold. So if it would be more than 50%, that's the majority. So this would be perceived as a consequence. If it's below 50, it's not the majority, then it would be not perceived as a consequence. And then we used confidence intervals to know where to, if it was over or on or below that threshold. And we have one dimension, so competition, which has a low perception. That's how we called it, low perception. So it is below 50%. And then we have 3 dimension in yellow, which have a confidence interval hitting the 50%. So those are not significatively different than 50%. So we cannot say if they are more or less. And all the green ones are higher than 50%. There are 7 of them. And those in light gray were between 50 and 75%. And those higher than 75%, we gave them a strong perception. Just to have a little bit more something to work on. And I will speak about one result, which is competition, because it was unexpected. In neoclassical theory, competition is essential. It's an essential component of market efficiency, and it helps having an optimal use of resources. And for many producers, especially international competition, put pressure on the price they receive. So we would have expected a feeling for more competition. 3 elements or 3 hypotheses can explain why we have such a low perception of negative effect related to competition. First is that in agriculture, we are in an oligopsony market structure, so farmers do not, in most cases, impact supply directly. Therefore, it means that if your neighbor has a really good year and a really good yield, it doesn't affect the price that you're going to get, so you don't feel so much the competition. This would not be the case in really specific market like CSA, where one farmer entering the market would, or doubling the amount of baskets they do, would really change the whole price dynamic inside this market. Second, there are already many regulations in Canada. If we think about supply management or marketing boards, then those policies are already reducing this competition effect we could expect in markets. So maybe there is just already enough protection so that producers don't feel so much there's competition. And the third hypothesis is that farmers just perceive competition as a natural thing, not as a bad thing. So that would be more in line with Stephanie Malin's idea of naturalization of neoliberal ideas. So to briefly sum the takeaways, there were 7 dimensions having significantly more than 50% of agreements for the perception of negative effects. So there is something. It's an interesting way of looking at it. It is not all the dimension, otherwise we could have questioned the pertinence of doing this kind of analysis. But it seems that some dimensions are more important than others, or at least have this perception of having more negative effect than others. and competition was not a dimension where the majority of producers were considering that there were a negative effect. For the second analysis I'm going to show you, we looked at the different type of responses, and we divided it into two types, the Polanyian ones and the non-Polanyians. So a Polanyian type of response is where individuals have perceived that there is an issue and are trying to react, while the non-Polanyian ones are where individual didn't perceive an issue. So if I go back to the structure of the survey, and we're looking at it from each dimension. So we're looking vertically from this structure. Individual could have a insert agree, agree, and agree. So they agree there's consequence, they agree that the certification is reducing it, and they are looking for government to do more. On the other hand, someone could have a different type of response and say, I disagree, there's a consequence, but I still agree the certification is reducing this consequence and government should do more. So let's look at what we have. So on the first part here on top, what we see, and this might look familiar because the height of the bar is the same as in the graphic I showed before, because people who agree there's consequences are the same. However, the difference is the color within it. So it's broken down by the type of responses that individuals have. So in purple, it is a market and government protection. What it means is that people have agreed to all three questions. So they agree there is an issue, they agree that there's the certification is working, and they look for government for more. While in green, individuals have, or respondents have said that they agree there is a consequences, they disagree that the certification is reducing it, but they still look for more government protection. And market protection is the opposite. So they agree that there is a consequence, they agree the certification is doing something, but they are not looking for government for more. And then in red, the other protection, which is not quite popular, is that people agree there is an issue, but disagree with both the government and the market type of protection. So we could guess they're either still searching for a way to resolve this issue, or they are using something else, maybe networks or trust or something else. So again, let's just speak about the bottom part. This is just helping to visualize the proportion of each types within each block. So we have it in percentage, and it's the same color of the same meaning. Just help having more and a better understanding of what it is. So again, we have different and important variation between each dimension. The economic dimension is a bit lower and a bit more diverse. We can see that the market and governmental protection are not as popular as in the other categories. And government is the second most popular. And I would like to bring your attention on one specific dimension, which is GE, so genetically engineered organism. And if we look, it is really similar in terms of number of producers who agree there is a negative effect. It's really similar to biodiversity, but then the proportions are really different. There's a lot of people who perceive that the certification is not as useful, is not really working. And one of the potential explanation is that the question was really speaking about the propagation of GE. So the certification question was asking, do you perceive that the organic certification help you reduce the propagation of GE? Well, when you think more about it, it is possible that respondents have perceived that yes, the organic certification allows me not to use GE on my individual farm, but I'm also concerned about GE everywhere. And the certification doesn't help reduce that. So those are two different issues, and that's maybe what explains such a difference. Also, if we look at synthetic pesticides, soil protection, animal welfare, and biodiversity, if we group the purple, so market and government protection, with market protection, you end up with a really strong percentage. And those are elements that are specifically covered in the organic standards. So it suggests that the organic standards are working for what is specifically covered in it, while and the exception would be GE, where although it is specifically covered in the standard, there still seems to be something playing here at play. So this highlights maybe the limits of market tools in bringing a solution to a specific issue, and also that even those dimensions, which are, it's breaking down the organic narrative in few parts, but it can still be broken down, and it seems to be affecting how people are looking for protection. Now, if we look at the non-Polanyian, so this is just the opposite of the other graph, so the missing part. So it's coming from the top to the bottom. We have three different types of non-Polanyian protection. The first one is indifferent, which is simply individuals who have answered neither to the consequence question. So those individuals are, and they have also said, agreed, or yeah, they have agreed to at least one of the government or certification question. So those individuals are not sure about the presence of an issue, but they are still looking for protection. And the inconsistent are the ones, so in orange, are the ones who have disagreed with the identification of an issue, but still agree with some kind of protection, while the non-Polanyian are the one who disagreed all the way. So from this perspective, for Polanyian scholarship, it questions a little bit what to do with those individuals who are a little bit unsure about an issue, but still look for protection. Is it really a specific type of individual, or is it just something that the survey hasn't been able to capture? It's possible. So the main takeaway, again, important variation between the dimensions and between the categories. It follows up with the previous one. The market and government and protection. So the both combined was the most common types of protection that people were seeking. So not just one, but really a combination of it. We've seen with the GE case that there might be some limit to the way that market tools are bringing protection. That might be why we need to combine markets and government types of protection. And also that there might be more issues, that the issues we had, the 11 one we've chosen, we could be broken down, that we could more specifically identify what kind of protection people are looking at if you broke it down into more limited issues like on the farm, or global issues like agriculture in general. Well, what does it mean for organic agriculture? And I do not want to get too specific here because it is not a representative sample. Results should not be generalized, but it is working in general. What I mean by that, it's the core organic aspects that are in the standards seem to be perceived as working well. So that seems to be a good thing. But there's still more to do. So there are other aspects that are not specifically covered in the organic standard that could be integrated in there. And also, it would be interesting to see how the organic organization or the organic proponents are trying to just go beyond the certification and really frame their goals or the issues they're trying to solve as using a combination of tools. So the certification, but also complemented with government intervention and network in regional food system, for example. So really to be active on those two aspects that we've identified, and the third one that we haven't really spoke about, which is more network and civil society. For policy implication. And before going narrow down, from a general perspective, the Polanyian idea highlight that market exchange is a tool for this at the service of society. So the economy is ours, and therefore we should not be afraid to intervene when we need to, when there are negative consequences, because we should not be controlled by a tool we have created. We should stay in control of it. Now, if we drill down a little bit on the different mechanism of protection for each type that we've looked at, and I included civil society here because that would most likely be really pertinent for further research. But to really understand how do individual or why individual first perceive an issue, and second, how does each type of protective response is working? So how does government is really able to reduce one issue? That's a little bit more straightforward, but for market tools and civil society, this is a little bit more confused maybe. So that could be something that could be considered when people are writing down policies. More specifically, if we look at the GE, it would be important to consider that market tools have limits. So that's a little bit what suggests the GE example, is that the market tool will be effective, but only on markets. And it is also generally voluntary. So it does not necessarily affect everybody. And there would be a need for complementarity. I said it before, but to be able to articulate when there's an issue that governments or individual groups want to solve, to really consider government, market tools, and civil society as a box of tools that you can use and frame a response based on the strength of each of those different tools. So I'm sure you have questions or comments, and then we'll speak about those.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing this information with us. It was very informative. So we did have a couple of questions pop up during the presentation. Our first question is, will the surveys be written and published as a report or some sort of summary which can be accessed?
Well, Janelle, you could email me directly if you're interested in, but yes, I will summarize it in a really accessible form to be shared for the producers who have answered the survey. They had a checkbox to give their email, so I could give them some feedback. But I will not include the survey directly in it, and not all analysis. Like that would be really straightforward. But the whole thesis of the whole survey and more detail about other analysis we've done and about how the survey is made.
Our second question is from John, and his question is, would you say there is only one organic movement, or does it seem there are several movements depending on which dimensions we examine?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would say there would be different movements, and that would be something to bring into the Polanyian scholarship, is that even if we go back to the more general narrative that I described earlier, it is one thing. But when we look at it from different dimension, it seems like if each issue could be a separate counter movement on its own. So from this perspective, the organic movement is a group of counter movement that have found some similarities and that are conveyed together, but that they could be different and they could use different means to achieve their goal. So if I think about soil protection or soil restoration, a farmer could be organic farmer and part of the regenerative agriculture movement. So then they would be active in different groups, but trying to achieve the same goal. So yeah, I think it can be broken down into many different counter movement.
Okay, there is another question. Have you looked at only vegetable-related organic producers, or were animal and or even fish, shellfish producers considered in your analysis?
There were producers with livestock, but nobody answered they had any fish or shellfish production. Although I know they are slowly getting developed with the new, but it's not that new anymore, but the standards are related to fish production. So that might be something that will get more interesting to look at in the future. But nobody answered the survey that we're a fish producer. Well, we're waiting. I can try to get the number for Janelle about the number of animal producer. For Janelle, many producers had different types of production. So I have just counted them from the overall total. So there are 126 respondents, but there were a total of 284 types of production. So many had more than 5 and stuff like that. But there were 21 dairy producer, there were 15 cattle producer, 7 swine producer, 19 eggs producers, 9 poultry producers, and 5 goat and sheep. There were 11 other producers, but I think it's like a more marginal production. I don't think there were any fish in there.
So I would like to once again thank you, Mark, for your great presentation. I would also like to thank the audience for attending this webinar and for their participation. Have a great rest of the day, everybody, and thank you for participating.
Thank you for joining.